Hey there, this video is talking to you about how to spot an old betta fish. What are some of the symptoms of an old betta fish and what do you want to do to an elderly or old betta fish? So it's basically elderly betta fish care 101 guide. So without further ado, let's get started. Number one is what is actually an old betta fish? How to spot one. To answer that, we will first need to understand the average life expectancy of a betta fish. Now, if you keep your betta fish in a small vase or like a small confined space, which we do not recommend, what will happen is the betta fish have a life expectancy of about 1 year. But if you keep them in some nice environment, you take care of them, you give them live plants, ensure that they are happy and healthy, most of the time a betta fish can live up to about 2 to 3 years. And in certain cases where you take care of it really well, it can even go up to 4 to 5 years. Now, how do we know whether a betta fish is approaching old age? What we would say is that it would depend on the betta fish symptom. Because just like humans, sometimes humans you can see 40 years old that looks really old, tired, exhausted all the time. But yet you have 60-year-old people who do not even have gray hair, they are young, they are active. So same goes to betta fish. You would want to look at the symptoms to determine whether it is an old betta fish or elderly betta fish that would require special care. Now, when it comes to the symptoms of an old age betta fish, it would be things such as the fin will no longer be as beautiful. It would have a very ragged or curly fins, and it would actually slow down in swimming. You may find that it even cannot compete with the younger betta fish or other younger fishes that move faster to actually get food. Or it could just be resting and sleeping a lot more than it was. And the color of the betta fish may also start to fade. And basically the final point to take note of is just that it will just lose a lot more of the enthusiasm, be a lot less energized, it flare less to other betta fish. Basically it's just like human getting old. What you can do if you see these signs is just primarily notice whether the betta fish is still able to take food and survive well or not. Because if all the younger fishes are taking out all the food pellet that this betta fish is supposed to take, well, then that can be an issue. You can solve this by either creating another retirement tank for the betta fish and then you just let it rest in that retirement tank so that it won't get disturbed by all these other younger fish. Or you could also just use a tongue and to feed the pellets directly to this old betta fish so that it can still get sufficient nutrition even though it is in its old age. And that's about it. That's all you need to know about your betta fish. That's all for this video. If you find this video to be helpful, please leave a thumbs up. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below. And if you would like to know more betta fish content, betta fish stuff, feel free to subscribe to our channel. And we'll see you in the next video. Take care.